Hey guys, tonight we're gonna explore when people started smoking weed and the long, detailed history of cannabis use throughout human civilization. This is gonna be an extremely thorough, methodical examination of cannabis history that will hopefully help you drift off to sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare for a long, exhaustive, and decidedly boring journey through the history of this ancient plant. Boring history for sleep. When did people start smoking weed? Chapter 1. The earliest evidence of cannabis used to understand when people started smoking weed. We must begin by examining the earliest archaeological and historical evidence of cannabis use by human societies. This requires looking back thousands of years into prehistory and piecing together fragmentary evidence from various sources, including archaeological sites, ancient texts, and botanical analyses. The story is complex and incomplete, as much of the evidence has been lost to time, but what remains gives us a picture of a plant that has been used by humans for a very long time. Cannabis sativa is the scientific name for the plant that produces marijuana, and it is a species that originated in Central Asia, probably in the regions that are now Mongolia and southern Siberia. The plant evolved in this region and spread from there through both natural dispersal and through human cultivation. And Thegene spread from there through both natural dispersal and through human cultivation and trade. The exact timing of when pont cannabis first appeared as a species is difficult to determine, but botanical evidence suggests it has existed for pont millions of years as part of the natural flora of Central Asia. The question of when humans first began using cannabis is separate from pont when the plant first evolved, and that it is this question that we will explore in exhaustive detail. The Pont-Kier's definitive evidence of human use of cannabis comes from archaeological sites in Central Asia and China, dating to the Neolithic period, which was the final phase of the Stone Age when humans were transitioning from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to settled agricultural communities. One of the earliest pieces of evidence comes from a Neolithic site in Taiwan where pottery dating to approximately 10,000 BCE has been found, with impressions of cord made from hemp fiber. Hemp is the term used for varieties of cannabis that are grown for fiber and seed, rather than for psychoactive properties, and these ancient cord impressions show that humans were processing cannabis plants to extract fibers for making rope and textiles at a very early date. However, this evidence does not tell us whether these ancient people were aware of or using the psychoactive properties of the plant. In China, archaeological evidence shows that cannabis was being cultivated by around 4000 BCE, during the Yangshao culture period. Seeds and plant remains have been found at multiple sites from this period, and there is evidence that the plant was being grown deliberately, rather than just being gathered from wild plants. The Chinese appear to have been using cannabis primarily for its fibers, which could be woven into cloth, and for its seeds, which could be eaten as food or pressed for oil. The question of when people began using cannabis specifically for its psychoactive effects, which is what most people mean when they ask about smoking weed, is more difficult to answer with certainty. The psychoactive effects of cannabis come primarily from a compound called THC, which is found in the flowering parts of female cannabis plants. Not all uses of cannabis involve these psychoactive effects, as hemp grown for fiber typically has very low THC content and was probably not used to get high. The earliest possible evidence of psychoactive cannabis use comes from a site in Romania where cannabis seeds were found in ritual vessels dating to approximately 3000 BCE. The context suggests these may have been used in religious or shamanic ceremonies, though we cannot be certain that the people at this site were aware of or exploiting the psychoactive properties. The seeds themselves do not contain significant THC, so their presence does not definitively prove psychoactive use. More compelling evidence comes from burial sites in western China, dating to around 500 BCE, where cannabis plants were found in a tomb along with other items that appear to have ritual significance. Analysis of these plant remains showed that they had relatively high THC content, suggesting they were specifically cultivated varieties selected for psychoactive properties rather than just hemp plants. The burial context suggests that cannabis may have been included for use in the afterlife or may have been used in funeral ceremonies. Another significant piece of evidence comes from the Pezerik burial mounds in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, dating to around 300 BCE. Archaeologists discovered bronze censers, which are vessels used for burning incense, containing burnt cannabis seeds. The presence of these censers, with cannabis in burial mounds of high-status individuals, suggests that smoking or burning cannabis for its effects was part of funeral rituals and possibly was used in religious or spiritual practices by these ancient nomadic people. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described a practice among the Scythians, who were nomadic people living in the region north of the Black Sea. Herodotus wrote that the Scythians would construct small tent-like structures, would place hot stones inside, and would throw cannabis seeds onto the hot stones, producing smoke that they would inhale. Herodotus described how the Scythians would howl with pleasure from the smoke, suggesting they were experiencing psychoactive effects. This account from Herodotus is significant because it is one of the earliest written descriptions of people deliberately using cannabis to alter their consciousness. However, we must note that Herodotus was not an eyewitness to this practice, but was reporting what he had heard from others, and his accounts are not always completely reliable. Archaeological evidence from Scythian sites does support the general accuracy of his description, as cannabis seeds and burning vessels have been found at multiple Scythian burial sites, confirming that cannabis was indeed used in some ritual context by these people. In ancient China, there are references to cannabis in medical text dating to around 100 CE, where it is mentioned as a treatment for various ailments. The Chinese appear to have recognized both the medicinal properties and potentially the psychoactive properties of cannabis, though the exact nature of their use is not always clear from the surviving texts. The legendary Chinese emperor Shen Nung, who is credited with discovering many medicinal plants around 2700 BCE, according to traditional accounts, is said to have documented cannabis as a medicine, though these traditional accounts were written down much later and may not be historically accurate. In India, cannabis has a long history of use that is documented in ancient Sanskrit texts. The Atharva Veda, Goodnight, one of the 4 Vedas, which are ancient Hindu scriptures, probably composed around 1500–1000 BCE, mentions cannabis as one of the 5 sacred plants and refers to it as a source of happiness and liberation. The text suggests that cannabis was used in religious ceremonies and was considered a gift from the gods. However, the Vedas were transmitted orally for centuries before being written down, so dating their composition and the practices they describe is difficult. The use of cannabis in India developed into the preparation of various cannabis-based products, including bhang, which is a drink made from cannabis leaves and flowers, mixed with milk and spices, ganja, which is the flowering tops of female cannabis plants, and charas, which is hand-rolled hashish. These preparations have been used for thousands of years in India for religious, medicinal, and recreational purposes, and their use is deeply embedded in certain aspects of Indian culture. From these various pieces of evidence, we can conclude that humans have been using cannabis for at least 5,000 years and possibly longer, with the earliest definitive evidence of cultivation dating to around 4000 BCE and evidence of psychoactive use appearing by around 500 BCE at the latest and possibly much earlier. The plant was probably first used for its sponge fibers and seeds, with the discovery of its psychoactive properties coming later, though the exact sequence and timing remain uncertain. The spread of cannabis, used from its origins in Central Asia to other parts of the world, occurred gradually over thousands of years through trade routes, migration, and cultural exchange. Cannabis seeds and plant materials would have been carried along ancient trade routes, including the Silk Road, which connected China with the Middle East and eventually with Europe. As cannabis spread to new regions, different cultures developed their own uses and understandings of the plant. Understanding this deep history of cannabis use helps us appreciate that the smoking of weed, or the use of cannabis for its psychoactive effects, is not a modern invention but is a practice with ancient roots extending back thousands of years into human prehistory. The specific methods of use have evolved over time, the cultural contexts have varied enormously, and the legal and social status of cannabis has changed repeatedly, but the basic human interest in this plant and its effects has remained constant across vast stretches of time and across many different cultures. Chapter 2. Cannabis in Ancient Civilization. Having established the prehistoric origins of cannabis use, let us now examine in detail how various ancient civilizations used cannabis and what role it played in their societies. This examination will show us that cannabis use was widespread in the ancient world, and that it served multiple purposes, including religious, medicinal, and practical applications. In ancient Egypt, the evidence for cannabis use is somewhat controversial and is debated among historians. Some researchers claim that cannabis pollen has been found on mummies, including the mummy of Ramesses II, who ruled from 1279 to 11213 BCE, suggesting that cannabis may have been used in burial preparations or may have been used by the deceased during their lifetime. However, other researchers question whether this pollen evidence is reliable or whether it might represent contamination from more recent sources. Ancient Egyptian medical papyri, which are among the oldest medical texts in the world, contain references to a plant called shemshemet, which some scholars believe may be cannabis. These texts, dating to around 1550 BCE, describe using this plant to treat inflammation, glaucoma, and other conditions. The preparations described include topical applications and possibly oral consumption, though there is no clear evidence of smoking in ancient Egypt. The identification of shemshemet with cannabis is not certain, and some scholars believe it may refer to a different plant entirely. What is clearer is that ancient Egyptians definitely used hemp fibers for making rope and textiles, and fragments of hemp cloth have been found at Egyptian archaeological sites dating to various periods. The cultivation of cannabis for fiber was established in Egypt by at least the Ptolemaic period, around 300 BCE to 30 BCE, and may have existed earlier. The hemp fiber industry in Egypt was significant enough to leave clear archaeological traces, unlike the more uncertain evidence for psychoactive or medicinal use. In ancient Mesopotamia, the civilizations of Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria that flourished in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, there is limited evidence for cannabis use, and what evidence exists is ambiguous. Some cuneiform texts refer to a plant called kunubu or azalu, which some scholars believe may be cannabis, but the identification is uncertain. These texts suggest the plant was used medicinally and possibly in religious rituals, but without clearer botanical identification, we cannot be certain what plant was actually being described. The absence of strong evidence for cannabis in Valabinsk, Mesopotamia is interesting because this region was geographically positioned between the Central Asian homeland of cannabis and the Mediterranean world, where cannabis eventually spread. It is possible that cannabis did not become significant in Mesopotamian culture despite being available, or it is possible that evidence of its use has simply not survived, or has not been correctly identified in the archaeological cull and textual record. In ancient Greece, cannabis was known but does not appear to have been widely used for psychoactive purposes. The Greeks used hemp fibers for making rope, particularly for ships, and hemp rope is mentioned in various Greek texts. The Greek physician Dioscorides, writing in the 1st century CE, described cannabis in his medical text De Materia Medica, which was one of the most influential pharmacological texts of the ancient world. Dioscorides noted that cannabis could be used to make rope and also described its medicinal uses, including treating earaches and suppressing sexual desire. Interestingly, Dioscorides and other Greek medical writers do not describe using cannabis to produce intoxication or altered states of consciousness, which is notable given that the Greeks were certainly familiar with other intoxicating substances, including alcohol and various plants. This suggests that either the Greeks did not use cannabis psychoactively, or if they did, it was not common enough or important enough to be documented in the surviving texts. The varieties of cannabis available to the Greeks may have been hemp strains with low THC content that would not produce strong psychoactive effects even if consumed. In ancient Rome, the situation was similar to Greece. Hemp was cultivated for fiber, was used extensively in rope making and textile production. Roman agricultural writers, including Pliny the Elder and Columella, described the cultivation of hemp, its various uses. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, in his Natural History, mentioned that hemp grew in various parts of the Roman world and described its cultivation and processing. He also mentioned some medicinal uses of cannabis, including pain relief and treating various ailments. But again, there is no clear description of psychoactive use. The Romans were certainly familiar with consciousness-altering substances, as evidenced by their use of alcohol and their knowledge of various poisonous and medicinal plants. The absence of clear evidence for recreational cannabis use in Roman sources suggests that it was not a common practice, at least not among the educated classes who produced the texts that have survived. It remains possible that cannabis was used psychoactively by some segments of Roman society, perhaps among lower classes or in certain religious cults, without this use being documented in surviving texts. In Persia, there's some ancient empire that controlled much of the Middle East and Central Asia from around 550 BCE to 330 BCE. Cannabis appears to have been more significant. The Zoroastrian religion, which was the dominant religion of ancient Persia, included references to cannabis in some bin texts, though the interpretation of these references is debated. The Avesta, the pot sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, mentions a pot plant called bangha, which some scholars identify as cannabis. This plant is described as having intoxicating properties, and is associated with religious experiences. The Persian physician Avicenna, writing around 1000 CE, described cannabis in his medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, which became one of the most influential medical texts in both the Islamic world and in medieval Europe. Avicenna described various medicinal uses of cannabis and also warned about potential negative effects of excessive use. His descriptions suggest that by this time, cannabis was well known in Persian medicine and that both its therapeutic potential and its risks were recognized. In ancient India, as mentioned earlier, cannabis had deep religious and cultural significance. The Hindu god Shiva is traditionally associated with cannabis, and various mythological stories describe Shiva's use of the plant. Cannabis was and continues to be used in certain Hindu religious ceremonies and festivals, particularly the spring festival of Holi. The religious use of cannabis in India is complex and is embedded in philosophical concepts about consciousness, spirituality, and the nature of reality that are central to Hindu thought. The Ayurvedic medical tradition of India, which developed over thousands of years and which continues to be practiced today, includes cannabis as one of its medicinal plants. Ayurvedic texts describe various preparations of cannabis and their uses for treating pain, digestive problems, sleep disorders, and other conditions. The integration of cannabis into Ayurvedic medicine shows that Indian physicians recognize the plant's therapeutic potential and develop sophisticated methods for preparing and administering it. In ancient China, as mentioned earlier, cannabis was used primarily for fiber and seed, but there is also evidence medicinal use. The legendary Chinese physician Hua Tuo, who lived in the 2nd century CE, is credited with using cannabis preparations as an anesthetic during surgical procedures, though accounts of his work come from later sources and may be embellished. Chinese medical texts from the early centuries CE describe using cannabis to treat various conditions, including pain, inflammation, and nervous disorders. The spread of Buddhism from India to China, Tibet, and other parts of Asia may have played a role in transmitting knowledge about cannabis and its uses. Buddhist texts mention cannabis in some contexts, and some Buddhist practitioners may have used cannabis in meditation or religious practices, though this is a complex and debated topic among scholars of Buddhist history. The relationship between Buddhism and cannabis use varies by region, time period, and specific Buddhist tradition. Examining the evidence from these various ancient civilizations shows us that cannabis was known and used throughout much of the ancient world, though the specific uses and the cultural significance varied considerably from one society to another. Some societies used cannabis primarily for practical purposes like fiber and seed. Some developed medicinal applications, and some incorporated cannabis into religious and spiritual practices. The smoking of cannabis specifically for psychoactive effects appears to have been less common, or at least less well documented, than other uses in many of these ancient societies. The fragmentary nature of the evidence makes it difficult to draw definitive conclusions about exactly when and where people first started smoking weed in the sense of deliberately consuming cannabis for its intoxicating effects. What we can say with confidence is that by the time written records become available from various ancient civilizations, cannabis was already known and was being used in various ways, suggesting that the discovery of its psychoactive properties had occurred much earlier, possibly thousands of years earlier in the prehistoric period. Chapter 3: The spread of cannabis through medieval times. As we move from ancient times into the medieval period, roughly from 500 CE to 1500 CE, the use and spread of cannabis continued to evolve. During this period, cannabis moved along trade routes, was adopted by new cultures, and began to appear in new regions. Let us examine in detail how cannabis use developed and spread during the Middle Ages in various parts of the world. In the Islamic world, which expanded rapidly in the 7th and 8th centuries CE to encompass much of the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia and Europe, cannabis became known and was integrated into medical practices. Islamic physicians built upon the earlier Persian and Greek medical traditions and further developed the medicinal uses of cannabis. The use of hashish, which is a concentrated form of cannabis made from the resin of the plant, appears to have developed or at least become more widespread in the Islamic world during the medieval period. The term hashish itself comes from Arabic, and the earliest clear references to hashish use in the Islamic world date to around the 10th or 11th century CE. There are various stories and legends about how hashish use began, including accounts that attribute its introduction to certain Sufi mystics who used it in religious practices. The historical reality is probably more complex and less dramatic, with hashish use developing gradually as people experimented with different preparations of cannabis and discovered that concentrating the resin produced stronger effects. The use of hashish in the medieval Islamic world was controversial and was debated by religious scholars. Some Islamic authorities condemned hashish use as intoxication that was forbidden under Islamic law's prohibition of intoxicating substances. Others argued that hashish was different from alcohol and was not explicitly forbidden in the Quran, making its use a matter of interpretation and debate. This debate about the religious permissibility of cannabis continues in Islamic societies to the present day. Despite religious controversies, hashish use became fairly widespread in certain parts of the medieval Islamic world, particularly in Egypt, Persia, and parts of Central Asia. Hashish was consumed in various ways, including eating it in preparations mixed with honey or other substances, and eventually smoking it became common as well, particularly after the introduction of tobacco to the region in the 16th century, provided a model for smoking plant materials. The association between hashish and certain mystical or heterodox religious movements led to stories and stereotypes about hashish users that influenced Western perceptions of cannabis. The term assassin is sometimes claimed to derive from hashish in, supposedly a group of medieval Islamic warriors who used hashish, though this etymology is disputed by many scholars and may be a later invention or misunderstanding. Such stories, whether accurate or not, contributed to Western ideas about cannabis and the Orient that would influence attitudes in later centuries. In medieval Europe, cannabis was known primarily as hemp and was cultivated extensively for fiber production. Hemp was an important industrial crop in medieval Europe and was used to make rope sails for ships and textiles. The cultivation and processing of hemp was a significant economic activity, and many European towns and regions had established hemp industries. Kings and governments encouraged hemp cultivation because of its importance for naval purposes, as hemp rope was essential for rigging ships. The use of cannabis for medicinal purposes was known in medieval Europe through the medical texts that had been translated from Greek and Arabic into Latin. European physicians had access to the works of Dioscorides, Galen, Avicenna, and other ancient and Islamic medical authorities who described cannabis as a medicine. Medieval European medical texts included cannabis in their lists of medicinal plants and described various therapeutic applications. However, the psychoactive use of cannabis does not appear to have been common in medieval Europe, at least not in the form that would later be recognized as smoking weed. Europeans were using cannabis plants extensively for hemp fiber, and they were aware of its medicinal properties, but there is little evidence that they were consuming cannabis to get high. This may be partly because the varieties of cannabis grown in Europe for hemp had relatively low THC content and would not produce strong psychoactive effects even if consumed. It is also possible that psychoactive cannabis use did occur in medieval Europe but was not documented in the surviving text because it was associated with marginalized groups or was practiced secretly. The medieval period saw periodic concerns about witchcraft and heresy, and various substances were associated with these suspect practices. Some scholars have speculated that cannabis might have been one of the plants used in so-called witch ointments or in folk magic, but the evidence for this is tenuous and is often based on ambiguous references in texts that could refer to various different plants. In medieval China, cannabis continued to be used for fiber, seed, and medicine as it had been in ancient times. Chinese medical texts from the medieval period include extensive discussions of cannabis and its properties. The uses described are primarily medicinal, including pain relief, treatment of digestive disorders, and various other applications. There are also references suggesting that cannabis was used in Taoist religious practices by some practitioners, though the details are not always clear. In India and Southeast Asia, cannabis use continued along the lines established in ancient times, with cannabis being integrated into religious practices, medicine, and to some extent, recreational use. The preparation of bhang and other cannabis products remained part of certain Hindu traditions, and cannabis was cultivated both for these psychoactive uses and for fiber and seed. The spread of Indian cultural influence to Southeast Asia through trade and religious expansion brought knowledge of cannabis to regions that became Thailand, Cambodia, and Indonesia. In Africa, cannabis appears to have been introduced during the medieval period, probably through trade, contacts with the Islamic world, and possibly throh contacts with India. The Bidawithio period, probably through trade, contacts with the Islamic world, and possibly through contacts with India. The Balthi Ethiopian Coptic Church had connections with the Middle East, and there is some evidence that cannabis may have reached Ethiopia through these connections. However, the widespread use of cannabis in sub-Saharan Africa appears to be primarily a later development occurring after the medieval period through continued trade and cultural exchange. The medieval period was thus a time when cannabis was known and used in many parts of the world, but the patterns of use varied considerably. In Europe, it was primarily an industrial and medicinal plant. In the Islamic world, it was a source of controversy and debate, with hashish use becoming established despite religious objections. In India and China, traditional patterns of use continued. The global picture was one of diverse uses and understandings of cannabis, with no single dominant pattern. The question of when people started smoking weed in the modern sense is still not clearly answered by examining the medieval period. What we can say is that, by the end of the medieval period, around 1500 CE, the psychoactive effects of cannabis were well known in parts of the world, including India, Persia, and parts of the Islamic world, and various methods of consuming cannabis, including eating, drinking, and possibly smoking, had been developed. However, the widespread practice of smoking cannabis as the primary method of consumption was still in the future and would develop more fully in later centuries. Chapter 4. Cannabis in the Early Modern Period. The early modern period, roughly from 1500 CE to 1800 CE, saw significant changes in global trade, colonization, and cultural exchange that would affect the spread and use of cannabis. During this period, European powers began exploring and colonizing much of the world, creating new trade routes and facilitating the exchange of plants, animals, and cultural practices between different regions. Cannabis was among the many plants that moved around the world during this era of globalization. The European voyages of exploration and the establishment of colonial empires created a demand for hemp fiber for ships' rigging and sails. Hemp cultivation was encouraged and sometimes mandated in European colonies in the Americas because the fiber was considered essential for naval purposes. The British, Spanish, and other colonial powers required or encouraged their colonists to grow hemp, and hemp cultivation became established in various parts of North and South America during the 16th and 17th centuries. In Virginia, one of the first British colonies in North America, hemp cultivation was actually mandated by law in the early 17th century. Colonists were required to grow hemp as a way of ensuring the colony would have adequate supplies of this strategic material. Similar mandates or encouragements for hemp cultivation existed in other colonies. The hemp grown in colonial America was used for making rope and cloth and was an important cash crop for some farmers. However, the hemp grown in colonial America was cultivated for fiber and generally had low THC content. There is little evidence that American colonists were using this hemp to get high. They were aware that it was the same plant that was used for intoxication in other parts of the world, as European medical texts and travel accounts described the psychoactive uses of cannabis, but the American use was strictly industrial and medicinal. American and European medical books of this period included cannabis preparations for various ailments, following the traditions inherited from ancient and medieval medicine. In the Middle East and South Asia, cannabis use continued along established patterns. During the early modern period, the production and use of hashish remained common in parts of the Ottoman Empire, Persia and neighboring regions. European travelers to these areas encountered hashish use and wrote accounts describing it, which contributed to European awareness of cannabis as an intoxicant, though these accounts were often sensationalized or distorted by cultural biases and misunderstandings. One significant development during this period was the introduction of tobacco to the Old World from the Americas. Tobacco smoking spread rapidly around the world in the 16th and 17th centuries and became enormously popular in many societies. The techniques and apparatus for smoking tobacco provided a model that would later be applied to cannabis. Before tobacco became widespread, the smoking of plant materials was less common in many parts of the world, with cannabis typically being eaten or drunk rather than smoked. The tobacco pipe became a technology that could easily be adapted for smoking cannabis. In India during the early modern period under Mughal rule, cannabis use continued to be part of religious and cultural practices. The Mughal emperors had varying attitudes toward cannabis, with some being tolerant or even supportive of its use and others attempting to restrict or prohibit it. The drug trade, including in cannabis products, became more organized and commercialized during this period, with professional growers and sellers developing specialized products for different markets and uses. European colonial authorities in India encountered cannabis use and had to decide how to regulate it. The British East India Company, which increasingly controlled parts of India during the 18th century, initially allowed the cannabis trade to continue and even profited from it through taxation. The attitudes of British administrators varied, with some seeing cannabis as a dangerous drug that should be controlled, and others viewing it as a relatively harmless part of Indian culture that could be tolerated and taxed. In China during the early modern period, cannabis continued to be used medicinally and as a source of fiber. The Ming and Qing dynasties that ruled China during this period did not appear to have major concerns about cannabis as a drug problem, in contrast to their growing concerns about opium use, which would become a major issue in the 18th and 19th centuries. Cannabis remained part of traditional Chinese medicine, but does not appear to have been a focus of social concern or regulatory attention. In Africa during the early modern period, cannabis use began to spread more widely, particularly in southern and eastern Africa. The bat plant was probably introduced through trade, contacts with Arab and Indian traders who traveled to African ports. Cannabis cultivation and use became established in various African societies, with the plant being used both for psychoactive effects and for fiber. Different African cultures developed their own names for cannabis and their own uses and traditions around it. The use of cannabis in Africa was sometimes associated with religious or spiritual practices. In some societies, cannabis was used by healers or diviners as part of their work. In other societies, it became a recreational substance used in social settings. The spread of cannabis in Africa was gradual and uneven, with some regions adopting it enthusiastically, while others showed little interest. By the end of the early modern period, cannabis had become an established part of the cultural landscape in many parts of Africa. In Europe during the early modern period, cannabis remained primarily a source of fiber, rather than a psychoactive substance. European medical texts continued to list cannabis among medicinal plants, and cannabis preparations were available from apothecaries for treating various conditions. However, there is little evidence of recreational cannabis use in Europe during this period. European societies' preferred intoxicant was panchol, and while tobacco smoking became popular after its introduction from the Americas, cannabis smoking did not catch on in Europe during the early modern period. The early modern period thus set the stage for later developments in cannabis use. The global trade networks established during this era would facilitate the further spread of cannabis. The colonial encounters between Europeans and societies that used cannabis psychoactively would eventually lead to changes in European attitudes and uses. The introduction of tobacco smoking provided a new method for cannabis consumption that would become dominant in later periods. However, at the end of the early modern period, around 1800 CE, cannabis use was still primarily concentrated in certain regions and cultures, and the widespread global pattern of cannabis smoking that would emerge later had not yet developed. Chapter 5. Cannabis in the 19th century. The 19th century was a period of significant change in how cannabis was perceived and used around the world. During this century, cannabis became more widely known. In Western countries, medical interest in cannabis increased significantly, and the patterns of use began to change in ways that would shape the modern era. Let us examine this critical century in detail. Into early 19th century European imperial expansion brought Europeans into closer contact with societies that used cannabis psychoactively. British colonization of India meant that British administrators, soldiers, and travelers were exposed to Indian cannabis use on a large scale. French colonization of North Africa brought the French into contact with hashish use in Egypt and other Mediterranean regions. These colonial encounters led to increased European awareness of cannabis as an intoxicant and sparked interest in studying its effects. One pivotal moment came with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. Napoleon's soldiers encountered hashish use among the Egyptian population, and some began using it themselves. Napoleon became concerned that hashish use was affecting his troops' discipline and performance, and in 1800 he issued an order prohibiting the use of hashish by French soldiers in Egypt. This prohibition is sometimes cited as one of the first modern drug prohibition laws, though its enforcement was limited, and its effects were temporary as French forces withdrew from Egypt soon afterward. The French experience in Egypt sparked interest in hashish among French intellectuals and artists. In the 1840s, a group of French writers and artists in Paris formed the Club des Hachishines, or Hashish Eaters Club, where they experimented with hashish consumption and discussed its effects on creativity and consciousness. Members included famous figures such as Théophile Gautier, Charles Baudelaire, and Alexandre Dumas. Their writings about hashish helped popularize knowledge of cannabis in European literary and artistic circles and contributed to romantic and exotic associations with the drug. However, it is important to note that these French hashish experiments involved eating preparations of hashish rather than smoking it. The practice of smoking cannabis was not yet common in Europe, though it was becoming more established in other parts of the world. The hashish consumption by European artists was seen as exotic experimentation rather than as a regular social practice and remained limited to small groups of bohemians and intellectuals. In British India during the 19th century, cannabis use became a subject of official study and regulation. The British colonial government conducted extensive investigations into cannabis use in India, culminating in the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission report of 1894, which was one of the most comprehensive studies of cannabis ever conducted. This massive report, running to thousands of pages, examined cannabis cultivation, preparation, distribution, and use across India, and it attempted to assess the effects of cannabis on health and society. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission interviewed hundreds of witnesses, including doctors, government officials, cannabis users, and religious figures. The commission examined medical evidence, social evidence, and religious practices involving cannabis. The final report concluded that moderate use of cannabis in India was not generally harmful and was deeply embedded in cultural and religious practices, and that prohibition would be impractical and undesirable. The Commission recommended regulation and taxation rather than prohibition, and British policy in India followed these recommendations for several decades. In pawn medicine during the 19th century, cannabis became the subject of increased scientific interest in the West. In 1839, a British physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, who had been working in pawn India, published a paper describing his experiments with cannabis preparations for treating various medical conditions. O'Shaughnessy had learned about cannabis from Indian medical practices and had tested cannabis extracts on patients with conditions including tetanus, rabies, cholera, and epilepsy. He reported positive results in some cases and recommended that cannabis be added to the Western pharmacopoeia. Following O'Shaughnessy's work, cannabis tinctures and extracts became available from pawn pharmaceutical companies in Britain and America. Cannabis medicines were sold for treating pain, muscle spasms, nausea, insomnia, and numerous other conditions. Major pharmaceutical companies, including Eli Lilly, Parke Davis, and Squibb, produced cannabis-based medicines, and these products were widely available from pharmacies and through mail-order catalogs. Cannabis was listed in the pharmacopoeias of the United States, Britain, and other Western countries as a recognized medicine. The medical use of cannabis in the 19th century was distinct from recreational use and from the traditional uses in India and elsewhere. Western doctors were attempting to use cannabis in a scientific, measured way to treat specific conditions, and they were developing standardized preparations with known potencies. However, achieving consistent effects was challenging because the potency of cannabis varies considerably depending on growing conditions, processing methods, and the specific strain of plant used. This variability made medical cannabis less reliable than some other medicines and contributed to later, declining medical use. In the United States during the 19th century, hemp cultivation continued in some regions for fiber production, and cannabis was available as a medicine from pharmacies. However, the recreational smoking of cannabis was not common among the general American population during most of the 19th century. Cannabis smoking appears to have been introduced to the United States gradually, possibly through multiple routes, including sailors who had encountered it in foreign ports, immigrants from regions where cannabis use was traditional, and through the gradual diffusion of the practice from one group to another. By the late 19th century, cannabis smoking was becoming more common in certain American port cities, particularly among sailors, laborers, and immigrant communities. Cannabis was sometimes used in areas where African Americans and Mexican immigrants lived, and it was associated with these minority communities in ways that would later influence prohibition campaigns. The use of the Spanish word marijuana to refer to cannabis became more common in the southwestern United States, where Mexican influence was strong. In Mexico, during the 19th century, cannabis use became more widespread, particularly among lower class and rural populations. Cannabis plants grew well in the Mexican climate and required minimal cultivation, making it accessible to poor farmers and workers. Cannabis smoking became part of working-class Mexican culture, and various slang terms for cannabis developed in Mexican Spanish. This traditional Mexican cannabis use would later become significant when Mexican immigration to the United States increased in the early 20th century. The 19th century also saw continued spread of cannabis use in other parts of the world. In the Caribbean, cannabis was introduced, probably by indentured laborers brought from India after the abolition of slavery. These Indian laborers brought cannabis seeds and the tradition of cannabis use with them, and cannabis cultivation became established in Jamaica and other Caribbean islands. The association between cannabis and Rastafarian religious practices would develop later. In the introduction of the plant to the Caribbean occurred in the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, cannabis was known and used around much of the world. It was available as a medicine in Western countries. It was used recreationally and religiously in India and other parts of Asia. It was spreading in Africa and the Caribbean, and it was beginning to be used recreationally in some parts of the Americas. The smoking of cannabis was becoming more common, though eating cannabis preparations remained the dominant method of consumption in many places. The stage was set for the 20th century developments that would lead to widespread prohibition and to the modern patterns of cannabis use. Chapter 6. Early 20th century and the beginning of prohibition. The early 20th century marked a turning point in cannabis history as attitudes began to shift and various countries started implementing laws restricting or prohibiting cannabis use. Understanding this period requires examining the social, political, and racial factors that influence these policy changes, as well as the continued medical and recreational use of cannabis during this time of increasing restriction. In the United States in the early 1900s, cannabis remained legal and was still used medicinally, though medical use was declining as newer synthetic drugs became available that were more reliable in their effects. Aspirin, introduced in 1899, competed with cannabis for pain relief. Other new pharmaceutical products offered alternatives to cannabis for various conditions. Medical professionals were also becoming concerned about the variability in cannabis potency and the difficulty in achieving consistent dosing, which made cannabis less attractive as a medicine compared to drugs that could be precisely measured and standardized. Recreational cannabis use was increasing in certain American communities, particularly among Mexican immigrants in the Southwest, among African Americans in some cities, and in entertainment districts and ports where unconventional behaviors were more tolerated. Cannabis smoking in these communities was often conducted in private homes or in formal social settings rather than in public establishments. The drug was not yet a mainstream part of American culture but existed in specific subcultures. Beginning in the 1910s, some American states began passing laws restricting or prohibiting cannabis. These early anti-cannabis laws were often passed at the state or local level, and were frequently motivated by racial prejudices and social anxieties, rather than by objective assessment of cannabis's actual harms. In states with large Mexican immigrant populations, cannabis prohibition was sometimes explicitly linked to anti-Mexican sentiment. Law enforcement officials and politicians claimed that marijuana made Mexican immigrants violent and that prohibition was necessary for public safety, though these claims had little factual basis. Similarly, in some cities, cannabis prohibition was linked to racial prejudice against African Americans and to fears about jazz music and the social changes of the early 20th century. Cannabis use was associated with jazz musicians and with the nightclubs and entertainment districts, where racial integration sometimes occurred. Prohibitionists played on white fears about racial mixing and about the supposed dangers of cannabis making users violent or immoral. These racial dimensions of early cannabis prohibition are well documented in historical research and show how drug laws were used as tools of social control and racial oppression. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics was established in the United States in 1930, with Harry Anslinger appointed as its first commissioner. Anslinger became a vigorous advocate for cannabis prohibition and used sensationalist rhetoric to promote anti-cannabis laws. He made claims that cannabis caused insanity, violence, and crime, and he boosted work to create public fear about the drug. Anslinger's campaigning contributed to the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which effectively prohibited cannabis at the federal level through prohibitive taxation and regulation. The 1937 Marijuana Tax Act made it extremely difficult to legally produce, sell, or possess cannabis in the United States. While the law was framed as a tax measure rather than as an outright prohibition, the taxes and bourthal licensing requirements were structured in such a way that compliance was nearly impossible for most people. The act marked the beginning of federal cannabis prohibition in the United States, though enforcement would remain uneven for many years, and full prohibition would be formalized in later legislation. In other countries during the early 20th century, attitudes toward cannabis were also changing. International drug control efforts were gaining momentum, driven largely by Western countries that were concerned about opium, cocaine, and other drugs. Cannabis was initially not a major focus of international drug control efforts were gaining momentum, driven largely by Western countries that were concerned about opium, cocaine, and other drugs. Cannabis was initially not a major focus of international drug control, but it was gradually brought into the international regulatory framework. The International Opium Convention held at The Hague in 1912 was one of the first international drug control treaties and focused primarily on opium and cocaine. Cannabis was mentioned in some discussions, but was not included in the main provisions of the treaty. However, as international drug control efforts expanded, cannabis was increasingly treated as a dangerous drug that should be controlled. Egypt was particularly active in pushing for international cannabis control. The Egyptian government had long been concerned about hashish use and had implemented various domestic restrictions. At international conferences, Egyptian delegates argued that cannabis was a serious problem and should be subject to international control, similar to opium. These Egyptian efforts contributed to cannabis being included in later international drug control treaties. In 1925, at an international conference in Geneva, cannabis was added to the list of drugs subject to international control under the system being developed by the League of Nations. This marked an important step in the internationalization of cannabis prohibition. Though implementation of these international commitments varied considerably by country, some countries moved quickly to prohibit cannabis following the international agreements, while others maintained more liberal policies for decades. In Britain, cannabis was made illegal in 1928, following the International Drug Control Treaties. The British government had previously allowed cannabis to be sold for medical purposes and had not seen recreational cannabis use as a significant problem in Britain itself, but international pressure and changing attitudes led to prohibition. British colonies were also required to implement cannabis prohibitions, though enforcement varied and traditional uses continued in many areas despite the laws. In colonial territories around the world, cannabis prohibition created tensions between colonial authorities and local populations who had traditional patterns of cannabis use. In India, British prohibition efforts had to contend with the findings of the 1894 Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, which had concluded that prohibition was unworkable. The result was a patchwork of regulations that attempted to control cannabis use without completely prohibiting practices that were deeply embedded in Indian culture. In Africa, colonial authorities imposed cannabis prohibitions that criminalized traditional uses and created resentment. During this period, cannabis use actually continued and even increased in some places, despite prohibition efforts. In the United States, cannabis use in some communities was not significantly deterred by the new laws, and cannabis continued to be cultivated, distributed, and consumed in underground markets. The prohibition created a criminal market for cannabis and meant that users and sellers could face legal penalties, but it did not eliminate use. Medical research on cannabis continued during the early 20th century, despite increasing restrictions. Some researchers studied the chemistry of cannabis and began to identify and isolate the various compounds in the plant. In 1940, American chemists successfully isolated CBD, or cannabidiol, one of the major compounds in cannabis. In 1942, they isolated THC, though they did not yet fully understand its psychoactive properties. This chemical research laid important groundwork for later understanding of how cannabis works, though much of this research was forgotten or ignored during the decades of prohibition. By the middle of the 20th century, cannabis had gone from being a legal medicine and industrial crop in most Western countries to being a prohibited substance associated with criminality and social deviance. The speed of this transformation was remarkable, occurring over just a few decades in the early 20th century. The reasons for this shift were complex and included changing medical practices, international drug control efforts, racial prejudices, and shifting social attitudes. Understanding this period is crucial for understanding how cannabis came to have the legal status it has had through most of the 20th and early 21st centuries. Chapter 7: Cannabis in the mid to late 20th century. The middle and late decades of the 20th century saw dramatic changes in cannabis use, culture, and policy. Cannabis went from being a little-known drug used by small subcultures to being a major focus of drug policy, and a substance used by millions of people, particularly young people, in many countries. Let us examine this transformation in detail. In the 1940s and 1950s in the United States, cannabis use remained relatively uncommon and was associated with specific subcultures including jazz musicians, bohemian artists, and minority communities. The drug was illegal but was not yet a major focus of law enforcement attention. Some American servicemen were introduced to cannabis while serving overseas during World War II and brought knowledge of the drug back home. Cannabis was used in some American cities in entertainment districts and in underground clubs, but it had not penetrated mainstream American culture. The 1960s brought dramatic changes. Cannabis use increased enormously, particularly among young people and college students. The counterculture movement of the 1960s embraced cannabis as part of its rejection of mainstream values and conventional society. Cannabis use became associated with opposition to the Vietnam War, with the hippie movement, with rock music, and with youth rebellion generally. What had been a marginal drug used by subcultures became a mainstream part of youth culture, at least among certain segments of the population. The reasons for this explosion in cannabis use during the 1960s were complex. The baby boom generation was coming of age and was larger than previous youth cohorts, creating a distinct youth culture with its own values and practices. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and other social movements of the 1960s created a climate of questioning authority and cannabis challenging established norms. Cannabis use fit into this broader pattern of rejecting conventional morality and experimenting with new ways of living. Musicians and celebrities played a significant role in popularizing cannabis. Rock musicians openly sang about marijuana and appeared to endorse its use. The Beatles, Bob Dylan, and many other influential musicians acknowledged using cannabis. This celebrity endorsement made cannabis seem glamorous and countercultural rather than dangerous or criminal. Young people who admired these musicians wanted to emulate them, including trying the drugs they used. The increase in cannabis use led to increased law enforcement attention and to harsh penalties for possession and sale. The United States federal government classified cannabis as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, meaning it was classified as having no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse, putting it in the same category as heroin. penalties for cannabis offenses became severe, with long prison sentences possible for possession of even small amounts, and life sentences possible for major trafficking offenses. During the 1970s and 1980s, the war on drugs, initiated by President Richard Nixon and expanded by later administrations, made drug enforcement a top priority. Cannabis arrests increased dramatically, and hundreds of thousands of people were arrested each year for cannabis offenses. The majority of these arrests were for simple possession rather than for trafficking or sale. The harsh enforcement of cannabis laws had devastating effects on individuals and communities, particularly minority communities that were policed more intensively. Despite aggressive enforcement, cannabis use continued at high levels throughout the late 20th century. Surveys showed that a significant percentage of Americans, particularly younger Americans, had tried cannabis at some point. For many people, cannabis use was a normal part of social life, though it carried the risk of arrest and prosecution. The disconnect between popular practice and legal prohibition created ongoing tensions in drug policy. Internationally, cannabis use also increased during the late 20th century. In Europe, cannabis use grew during the 1960s and 1970s. Following similar patterns to the United States, European countries varied in their responses, with some maintaining strict prohibition and others adopting more tolerant approaches. The Netherlands famously implemented a policy of allowing small-scale cannabis sales in licensed coffee shops while keeping larger-scale production and distribution illegal, creating a gray market that tolerated use while theoretically maintaining prohibition. In developing countries, cannabis cultivation for export became a significant economic activity in some regions. Jamaica, Colombia, Mexico, and other countries exported cannabis to the lucrative markets in the United States and Europe. The international drug trade in cannabis was worth billions of dollars and involved sophisticated smuggling operations, violence between rival traffickers, and corruption of law enforcement and government officials. Cannabis prohibition created a large criminal economy with significant social costs. Medical interest in cannabis revived somewhat in the late 20th century. In the 1970s and 1980s, some AIDS and cancer patients discovered that cannabis helped with symptoms including pain, nausea from chemotherapy, and loss of appetite. These medical cannabis users sought legal recognition for their use and advocated for medical exceptions to cannabis prohibition. Some states began passing medical cannabis laws in the 1990s, allowing patients with certain conditions use cannabis legally with a doctor's recommendation. The resurgence of medical cannabis also spurred renewed scientific interest in the plant. Researchers discovered the endocannabinoid system in the early 1990s, which is a system in the human body that has receptors for cannabinoids and produces its own cannabinoid-like compounds. This discovery helped explain how cannabis works and opened up new areas of research into potential medical applications. However, the illegal status of cannabis in most countries made research difficult, as scientists needed special permissions to work with the drug and faced significant obstacles in conducting studies. By the end of the 20th century, cannabis occupied a paradoxical position in many societies. It was illegal and subject to harsh penalties, yet it was widely used. It was classified as having no medical value, yet many patients and some doctors believed it had therapeutic benefits. It was associated with danger and social harm in official rhetoric, yet many users reported enjoying it without experiencing negative consequences. These contradictions would set the stage for the policy changes and debates of the 21st century. Chapter 8: 21st Century Developments and Legalization. The early decades of the 21st century have seen remarkable changes in cannabis policy use, with several countries and jurisdictions moving toward legalization or decriminalization. Understanding these recent developments provides context for where cannabis policy may be heading in the future. Let us examine in detail the shifts that have occurred since the year 2000. The medical cannabis movement that began in the late 20th century gained significant momentum in the early 21st century. More American states passed medical cannabis laws, allowing patients with qualifying conditions to obtain and use cannabis legally. By 2020, the majority of American states had some form of medical cannabis program, ranging from restrictive programs that allowed only low-THC cannabis products to comprehensive programs that allowed dispensaries to sell cannabis to any patient with a doctor's recommendation for a wide range of conditions. The medical cannabis industry grew into a significant business in states where it was legal, with professional cultivation operations, processing facilities, and retail dispensaries. This industry demonstrated that cannabis could be produced and sold in a regulated market rather than only in the criminal black market. The success of medical cannabis programs helped shift public opinion toward viewing cannabis as a legitimate medicine rather than merely as a recreational drug. In 2012, voters in Colorado and Washington state approved ballot initiatives to legalize cannabis for recreational use by adults, not just for medical purposes. These were the first jurisdictions in the United States to implement full legalization. The laws allowed adults over 21 to purchase cannabis from licensed retailers, to possess limited amounts for personal use, and to grow a small number of plants at home. The laws also created regulatory systems for licensing and overseeing cannabis businesses and imposed taxes on cannabis sales. The Colorado and Washington legalization initiatives were closely watched by other states and countries to see what effects legalization would have. Supporters of legalization hoped it would eliminate the criminal market, generate tax revenue, reduce enforcement costs, and allow for better quality control and consumer protection. Opponents feared it would increase youth use, lead to more impaired driving, create public health problems, and send the wrong message about drug use. In the years since 2012, several other American states have legalized recreational cannabis through ballot initiatives legislation, including Oregon, California, Nevada, Massachusetts, Maine, and others. The implementation of these legalization systems has varied by state, with different rules about licensing, taxation, where sales can occur, and what restrictions apply. Some states have created successful legal markets, with hundreds of licensed businesses, while others have struggled with problems including continued black market activity, regulatory complexity, and conflicts with local governments. Canada became the first major industrialized country to legalize recreational cannabis nationally when it implemented the Cannabis Act in October 2018. The Canadian legalization followed years of debate and study, including a task force that examined international evidence and made recommendations for how legalization should be structured. The Canadian system allows adults to purchase cannabis from government-operated or licensed private stores, depending on the province, permits home cultivation of a limited number of plants, and creates strict rules about product safety, packaging, and marketing. Uruguay had actually been the first country to fully legalize recreational cannabis nationally, implementing legalization in 2013, several years before Canada. However, Uruguay's approach was quite different from Canada's and from the American state systems. Uruguay created a government-controlled monopoly on cannabis production and distribution, allowed pharmacies to sell cannabis, permitted home cultivation and cannabis clubs, and set very low prices to undercut the black market. The Uruguayan system has faced challenges including slow implementation and limited availability. In Europe, attitudes toward cannabis have been evolving, though full legalization has moved more slowly than in North America. The Netherlands has maintained its policy of tolerating small-scale cannabis sales in coffee shops while keeping production illegal, creating an anomalous backdoor problem where coffee shops can sell cannabis legally but cannot legally obtain it from producers. Portugal decriminalized all drugs, including cannabis, in 2001, treating possession as an administrative offense rather than a criminal one, and focusing on treatment rather than punishment. Spain allows private cannabis clubs where members can collectively cultivate and share cannabis, creating a semi-legal space for boy use. In 2021, Luxembourg announced plans to become the first European country to fully legalize recreational cannabis, joining Canada and Uruguay. Other European countries, including Germany and Switzerland, have been studying potential legalization or are running pilot programs. The European trajectory appears to be moving gradually toward more liberal policies, though the pace is slower and more cautious than in North America. Public opinion on cannabis has shifted dramatically in recent decades. In the United States, polls show that a majority of Americans now support legalizing cannabis, a reversal from earlier decades when most Americans supported prohibition. This shift in public opinion reflects changing cultural attitudes, generational change, as older voters who oppose legalization are replaced by younger voters who support it, and accumulating evidence from legal states that legalization has not caused the disasters opponents predicted. The kin effects of legalization have been studied intensively. though drawing definitive conclusions challenging because the policy changes are recent and many variables are involved. Some effects observed in legal states include tax revenue from cannabis sales has generated hundreds of millions or billions of dollars for legal states, though typically less than initially projected. This revenue has been used for education, drug treatment, public health, and other purposes, depending on how the legalization laws specified revenue would be allocated. The criminal justice impacts have included fewer cannabis arrests and reduced incarceration for cannabis offenses, freeing law enforcement to focus on other priorities. However, illegal cannabis activity has not been completely eliminated, as some people continue to operate outside the legal system to avoid taxes and regulations, or to sell to consumers under the legal age. Youth use of cannabis has not increased dramatically in most legal states, contrary to fears that legalization would send a message to young people that cannabis was safe. Some studies have found small increases in youth use, while others have found no significant change, or even decreases. The evidence suggests that legalization does not necessarily cause large increases in youth use, particularly if the legal system includes strong controls on youth access. Impaired driving has been a concern, and some legal states have seen increases in drivers testing positive for THC. However, interpreting this data is complicated by the fact that THC can remain detectable in the body for days or weeks after use, so testing positive does not necessarily mean the driver was impaired at the time. Developing better methods for detecting actual impairment from cannabis, as opposed to just detecting cannabis use at some point in the recent past, remains a challenge. Public health researchers have been monitoring for potential increases in problematic use, in cannabis use disorder, and in mental health issues that might be linked to increased cannabis availability. The evidence so far has not shown dramatic increases in these problems in legal states, but researchers caution that it may take more time for such effects to become apparent if they occur. The economic impacts have been significant, with legal cannabis industries creating thousands of jobs in cultivation, processing, retail, testing laboratories, and ancillary businesses. Legal cannabis has become a major industry in some states, though it faces challenges including banking restrictions because cannabis remains illegal under federal law in the United States, competition from the black market, high taxes, and regulatory complexity. Social equity has become an important issue in cannabis legalization. Advocates have pointed out that enforcement of cannabis prohibition fell disproportionately on minority communities, and they argue that legalization should include efforts to repair this harm and to ensure that members of communities harmed by prohibition have opportunities to participate in the legal cannabis industry. Some states have included social equity provisions in their legalization laws, though implementation has been challenging. The international situation remains complex. Cannabis is still classified as a prohibited drug under international drug control treaties, including the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. Countries that have legalized cannabis are technically in violation of these treaties, though the international community has not taken enforcement action. The international drug control system is under strain as more countries diverge from the prohibitionist consensus, and there are discussions about reforming or reinterpreting the treaties to accommodate different national approaches. As of the early 2020s, cannabis policy remains in flux in most parts of the world. Some jurisdictions have legalized, others have decriminalized, others maintain strict prohibition, and still others are studying their options and may move in various directions. The trend appears to be toward liberalization, but the pace and specific forms of reform vary enormously by jurisdiction. Cannabis policy is likely to continue evolving in coming years as more evidence accumulates about the effects of different approaches. Chapter 9: Methods of Cannabis Consumption Through History. Having examined when and where cannabis use developed, let us now turn to the question of how cannabis has been consumed throughout history. The methods of consumption have varied considerably and have changed over time, influencing the effects experienced and the cultural meanings associated with use. The earliest uses of cannabis, as we discussed in Chapter 1, likely involved consuming the seeds as food or using the fibers for rope and textiles, neither of which would produce psychoactive effects. The discovery that cannabis could alter consciousness probably came from accidentally consuming the flowering parts of the plant, or from deliberately experimenting with different parts of the plant, or from deliberately experimenting with different parts of the plant to see what effects they produced. Eating cannabis is likely one of the oldest methods of psychoactive consumption, cannabis can be eaten raw, though this is not particularly effective because the THC needs to be heated to be activated. More effective methods involve cooking cannabis in fat or oil, which allows the THC to dissolve and be absorbed. Various cannabis-containing foods have been prepared throughout history in different cultures. In ancient India, bhang was and continues to be prepared by grinding cannabis leaves and flowers with spices, herbs, and sometimes milk to create a drink. This preparation has been used for thousands of years in Hindu religious ceremonies and festivals. The preparation of bhang requires knowledge and skill to achieve the desired potency and flavor, and specialized bhang makers have traditionally prepared the drink for customers. In the medieval Islamic world, hashish was often consumed by eating it rather than smoking it. Hashish would be mixed with honey, nuts, or other ingredients to create edible preparations that could be stored and consumed as needed. Different recipes existed for hashish preparations, some designed for medicinal purposes and others for recreational or religious use. The effects of eating hashish develop more slowly than from smoking, but last longer and can be quite intense if a sufficient dose is consumed. In modern times, cannabis edibles have become increasingly sophisticated and varied. Cannabis can be baked into brownies, cookies, and other baked goods. It can be infused into butter or oil, which can then be used in any recipe. Cannabis-infused beverages have been developed including teas, sodas, and even coffee. Commercial cannabis edible companies in legal markets produce candies, chocolates, mints, gummies, and many other products with precisely measured doses of THC and CBD. Eating cannabis has both advantages and disadvantages compared to smoking. The advantages include avoiding the harmful effects of smoke inhalation, having longer-lasting effects, and being able to consume cannabis discreetly without the telltale smell of smoke. The disadvantages include slower onset of effects, making it easier to accidentally consume too much before feeling the effects, greater found difficulty in controlling the dose, and more intense effects that can be uncomfortable if too much is consumed. Smoking cannabis has become the most common method of consumption in the modern era, but it is unclear exactly when and where cannabis smoking first began. As mentioned earlier, the smoking of plant materials was not common in most parts of the world before the introduction of tobacco from the Americas in the 16th century. Tobacco smoking spread rapidly and provided a model and apparatus that could easily be used for cannabis. In India and parts of Asia, cannabis smoking using clay pipes called chillums has a long history, though the exact dating is uncertain. The chillum is a simple straight tube with a small bowl at one end, and a mouthpiece at the other. Cannabis is placed in the bowl and smoked, often mixed with tobacco, or used alone. Chillum smoking has religious associations in some Indian traditions and is part of certain Hindu practices, particularly among some Shaivite sadhus or holy men. In the Middle East and North Africa, water pipes or hookahs have been used for smoking tobacco and also for smoking hashish. The water pipe cools and filters the smoke, making it less harsh on the throat and lungs. Hashish would be crumbled and mixed with tobacco and smoked in these pipes in social settings. The hookah, lounge, or cafe became a traditional social institution in some Middle Eastern cities, though traditionally these establishments served tobacco rather than cannabis. In the West, cannabis smoking developed its own apparatus and rituals. The marijuana cigarette or joint became the iconic method of consumption, particularly in the mid-20th century. Rolling cannabis into a cigarette using rolling papers is a simple method that requires only minimal equipment and can be done quickly and easily. The joint can be smoked alone or passed around in a group, and the social ritual of sharing a joint became part of cannabis culture. Pipes made from various materials, including wood, metal, ceramic, and glass, have been used for smoking cannabis. The pipe offers advantages over joints, including not requiring rolling papers, being reusable, and potentially cooling the smoke somewhat. Glass pipes in particular became popular and developed into an art form, with glassblowers creating elaborate, colorful pipes that are functional art objects. The bong or water pipe is another common method for smoking cannabis. The bong uses water to cool and filter the smoke, allowing larger quantities of smoke to be inhaled with less harshness. Bongs range from simple homemade devices to elaborate glass pieces with multiple chambers and percolators. bong culture became particularly associated with cannabis use in certain communities and time periods. In recent decades, vaporization has emerged as a newer method of consuming cannabis. Vaporizers heat cannabis to a temperature that releases the active compounds as vapor without burning the plant material and producing smoke. This method avoids many of the harmful byproducts of combustion and is considered healthier than smoking, though still involving inhalation of substances into the lungs. Portable vaporizers have become popular, allowing discreet consumption without the strong smell of cannabis smoke. Dabbing form is a more recent consumption method that involves using concentrated cannabis extracts. These extracts, which include oils, waxes, and shatters made by extracting cannabis from plant material, can be extremely potent with THC concentrations of 80% or higher, compared to perhaps 15–25% in typical cannabis flowers. Dabbing involves heating a surface and applying a small amount of concentrate, which vaporizes and is inhaled. This method produces very intense effects and has become popular among some users, but has raised concerns about health risks and the potential for increased tolerance and dependence. Topical application of cannabis is another method that has ancient roots and modern applications. Cannabis can be prepared in ointments, creams, or oils and applied to the skin. Topical cannabis is absorbed through the skin and can have local anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving effects without producing psychoactive effects throughout the body. Ancient medical texts described topical cannabis preparations, and modern medical cannabis patients use topical products for arthritis, muscle pain, and skin conditions. Tinctures, which are alcohol-based extracts of cannabis, provide another consumption method. A few drops of tincture can be placed under the tongue where the cannabis compounds are absorbed through the mucous membranes into the bloodstream. Tinctures were common in 19th century Western medicine and have made a comeback in modern medical and recreational cannabis markets. They offer precise dosing and quick absorption without requiring smoking or eating. The various methods of consuming cannabis produce different experiences and have different health implications. The BSO route of administration affects how quickly effects begin, how intense they are, how long they last, and what kind of harm might result. Smoking produces rapid effects within minutes but involves inhaling combustion byproducts. Eating produces slower effects that last longer but makes dosing more difficult. Vaporizing avoids combustion but still involves inhalation. Topicals avoid systemic effects entirely but have limited applications. The evolution of consumption methods shows human ingenuity in finding ways to use this plant and reflects changing technologies, cultural practices, and understandings of health and harm. The current diversity of consumption methods, particularly in legal markets where cannabis companies can innovate and market new products, is probably greater than at any previous time in history. Chapter 10. Conclusion and final reflections. As we conclude this exhaustive examination of when people started smoking weed, we should reflect on the long and complex history we have traced. The question of when cannabis use began does not have a simple answer because cannabis has been used by humans in various ways for thousands of years, and the specific practice of smoking cannabis for psychoactive effects developed gradually in different places at different times. What we can say with confidence is that cannabis has been part of human culture for at least 5,000 years, with the earliest evidence of cultivation dating to around 4000 BCE in China. The plant was initially used for fiber and seed, providing practical materials for making rope, cloth, and food. The discovery of cannabis's psychoactive properties occurred at some point, possibly quite early, and certainly by around 500 BCE, there is clear evidence of people using cannabis for its effects on consciousness. Throughout ancient and medieval times, cannabis was known and used in many parts of the world, with different cultures developing different uses and understandings of the plant. In some societies, cannabis was primarily a source of industrial fiber. In others, it was an important medicine. In still others, it was incorporated into religious and spiritual practices. The diversity of cannabis uses across cultures and time periods shows the plant's versatility and the many ways humans have found to use it. The specific practice of smoking cannabis appears to have developed or become widespread somewhat later than eating cannabis, possibly influenced by the introduction of tobacco smoking in the 16th century, which provided a model for smoking other plant materials. By the 19th century, cannabis smoking was established in various parts of the world and was beginning to spread to new regions. The 20th century saw dramatic changes in cannabis use and policy. Cannabis went from being a legal medicine and industrial crop to being a prohibited substance associated with criminality. Then, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, cannabis policy began shifting, again toward legalization or decriminalization in some places. These rapid changes in legal status and social attitudes demonstrate how drug policies are shaped by social, political, and cultural forces rather than solely by the intrinsic properties of the substances themselves. Throughout this long history, people have been drawn to cannabis for various reasons, including its medicinal properties, its psychoactive effects, its practical uses for fiber and seed, and its role in religious or cultural practices. The human relationship with cannabis has been enduring and multifaceted, adapting to different circumstances while maintaining certain continuities. Understanding this history provides context for current debates about cannabis policy. Cannabis prohibition, which has been the dominant approach in most of the world for the past century, is actually a relatively recent and historically anomalous approach to this ancient plant. For most of human history, cannabis was legal and was regulated through cultural norms rather than through criminal law. The return to legal regulation in some jurisdictions represents, in some sense, a return to the historical norm rather than a radical departure. Chapter 11. The Science of Cannabis, Understanding the Plant. To fully appreciate the history of cannabis use, we must understand the plant itself and the scientific knowledge that has accumulated about it over time. The development of scientific understanding of cannabis has been gradual and has been hampered in recent decades by prohibition, but significant knowledge has been gained, particularly in recent years. Let us examine the botany, chemistry, and pharmacology of cannabis in detail. Cannabis sativa is a member of the Cannabaceae family, which also includes hops, the plant used in brewing beer. Cannabis is an annual plant, meaning it completes its life cycle in 1 year, germinating from seed, growing, flowering, producing seeds, and dying within a single growing season. The plant is dioecious, meaning individual plants are either male or female, though hermaphroditic plants that have both male and female flowers can also occur. Female cannabis plants are the ones primarily valued for psychoactive use because they produce the flowers that contain the highest concentrations of cannabinoids, the chemical compounds responsible for cannabis's effects. Male plants produce pollen to fertilize female plants, but have much lower cannabinoid content and are typically removed from cultivation areas intended for drug production to prevent fertilization, which would cause the female plants to produce seeds rather than directing energy toward producing larger, more resinous flowers. The cannabis plant has distinctive leaves that are typically palmately compound, meaning each leaf consists of several leaflets radiating from a central point. The number of leaflets varies but is often 7 or 9. The leaves have serrated edges and are covered with fine hairs. The distinctive shape of cannabis leaves has made them an iconic symbol associated with cannabis culture. Cannabis plants can vary considerably in appearance depending on the variety or strain. Some plants are tall and lanky with thin leaves, while others are short and bushy with broader leaves. Traditionally, cannabis has been divided into 3 subspecies or varieties: Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Bichon. Cannabis ruderalis, though botanists debate whether these truly represent distinct subspecies or varieties. Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Bichon. Cannabis ruderalis, though botanists debate whether these truly represent distinct subspecies or just variations within a single species. The distinctions between these types relate to their geographic origins, physical characteristics, and to some extent their effects when consumed. Cannabis sativa varieties originated in equatorial regions and tend to be taller plants with longer flowering times and effects that are typically described as more energizing and cerebral. Cannabis indica varieties originated in the Hindu Kush mountain regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan and tend to be shorter, bushier plants with shorter flowering times and effects often described as more relaxing and sedating. Cannabis ruderalis is Dinity, a variety from Russia and Central Asia that is smaller and has lower cannabinoid content, but has the unusual property of flowering based on age rather than on light cycle, a trait called auto-flowering that has been bred into some modern strains. However, these traditional distinctions have become blurred through extensive crossbreeding, and most cannabis available today is a hybrid combining genetics from multiple varieties. The effects of different strains depend less on whether they are labeled indica or sativa and more on their specific chemical profile, particularly their cannabinoid and terpene content. Cannabinoids are the chemical compounds unique to cannabis that are responsible for most of its effects. Over 100 different cannabinoids have been identified in cannabis, though only a few are present in significant quantities. The two most important and well-studied cannabinoids are THC and CBD. THC, or delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, is the particularly psychoactive cannabinoid in cannabis. It is THC that produces the high associated with cannabis use, including altered perception, changes in mood, and various other mental effects. THC was first isolated and its structure determined in 1964 by Israeli chemist Raphael Mechoulam and his colleagues, a breakthrough that enabled much subsequent research into how cannabis works. CBD, or cannabidiol, is another major cannabinoid that does not produce intoxication, but has various effects including reducing anxiety, inflammation, and seizures. CBD has become popular in recent years for medical use and is available in many jurisdictions even where THC-containing cannabis remains illegal. The ratio of THC to CBD in cannabis varies greatly between different strains, with some being high in THC and low in CBD, others being balanced, and still others being high in CBD with minimal THC. Other cannabinoids include CBN, or cannabinol, which is produced when THC degrades and which has mild psychoactive effects and sedating properties. CBG, or cannabigerol, which is a precursor to other cannabinoids and which is being studied for medical applications, and many others. The full range of cannabinoids and their effects is still being explored by researchers. Terpenes are aromatic compounds found in cannabis and in many other plants that give cannabis its distinctive smell and that also influence its effects. Different cannabis strains have different terpene profiles, producing different aromas including citrus, pine, earthy, sweet, or skunky smells. Terpenes interact with cannabinoids in what is called the entourage effect, where the combined effect of multiple compounds is different from the pint effect of any single compound alone. Common terpenes in cannabis include myrcene, which has a musky, earthy aroma and is thought to have sedating effects, limonene, which has a citrus aroma and is thought to have mood-elevating effects, pinene, which smells like pine and is thought to have alertness-promoting effects, and many others. Understanding pine terpene profiles has become important in pine cannabis cultivation and product development as producers try to create specific effects through particular combinations of cannabinoids and pine terpenes. The pharmacology of cannabis, meaning how it affects the body, was not well understood until the discovery of the endocannabinoid system in the 1990s. Researchers discovered that the human body, and indeed all vertebrate animals, have a system of receptors that respond to cannabinoids. These receptors, called CB1 and CB2 receptors, are found throughout the body but are concentrated in different areas. CB1 receptors are primarily found in the brain and central nervous system, while CB2 receptors are primarily found in the immune system and peripheral tissues. The endocannabinoid system is involved in regulating many physiological processes, including appetite, pain sensation, mood, memory, immune function, and reproduction. The body produces its own endocannabinoids, including compounds called an endamide and 2-AG, that bind to these receptors and regulate these functions. THC works by binding to cannabinoid receptors, particularly CB1 receptors in the brain, and mimicking or interfering with the body's own endocannabinoids. The discovery of the endocannabinoid system was a major breakthrough in understanding how cannabis works and also opened up new areas of research into how the body's own cannabinoid system functions. Researchers are studying potential medical applications of compounds that interact with the endocannabinoid system, including not just plant-derived cannabinoids, but also synthetic compounds designed to target specific receptors. The effects of cannabis on the body and mind are complex and vary based on dose, method of consumption, individual biology, and the specific chemical profile of the cannabis being used. Common short-term effects include altered perception of time, enhanced sensory perception, changes in mood, including euphoria or anxiety, increased appetite, dry mouth, red eyes, and impaired short-term memory and coordination. These effects typically last 2 to 4 hours when cannabis is smoked and 4 to 8 hours or longer when it is eaten. Long-term effects of regular cannabis use are still being studied and are somewhat controversial. Some research has found associations between heavy cannabis use and cognitive impairments, particularly when use begins in adolescence. Other research has found that cannabis dependence can develop in some regular plant users, with withdrawal symptoms including irritability, sleep problems, and anxiety occurring when use stops. However, the severity of these long-term effects is debated, and many researchers believe cannabis is less harmful than other commonly used psychoactive substances, including alcohol and tobacco. The paramedical potential of cannabis has been recognized for thousands of years, as we have discussed, but scientific study of medical cannabis was limited for much of the 20th century due to prohibition. Research has accelerated in recent decades as laws have become more permissive. Studies have found evidence that cannabis or cannabinoids can be useful for treating chronic pain, nausea, and vomiting from chemotherapy, multiple sclerosis, spasticity, epilepsy, and several other conditions. Many patients report using cannabis for conditions where the research evidence is limited but where they personally find it helpful, including anxiety, depression, insomnia, and PTSD. The development of scientific knowledge about cannabis has been an ongoing process spanning decades and involving researchers in many countries. Much remains to be learned, particularly about the long-term effects of different patterns of use. About the medical potential of minor cannabinoids and specific cannabinoid terpene combinations, and being called about individual variations in response to fiend cannabis. As profiction diminishes and research becomes easier to conduct, our scientific understanding of this ancient plant continues to grow. Chapter 12: Cannabis Cultivation. Through history, understanding the history of when people started smoking weed requires also understanding how cannabis has been cultivated throughout history. The methods of growing cannabis have evolved from simple wild harvesting to sophisticated modern cultivation techniques, and these changes in cultivation have influenced availability, potency, and patterns of use. The earliest human use of cannabis probably involved gathering wild plants. Cannabis grows naturally in Central Asia and would have been available to early human populations who gathered plants for food, fiber, and medicine. Early humans would have recognized cannabis plants and learned through experience which parts were useful for which purposes. The transition from gathering wild plants to deliberately cultivating them was a crucial development in human history generally and in cannabis history specifically. The cultivation of cannabis, like the cultivation of other crops, probably began during the Neolithic period when humans were transitioning from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies. The earliest evidence of deliberate cannabis cultivation comes from China around 4000 BCE, as we discussed earlier. These early cultivators would have selected seeds from point plants with desirable characteristics and would have learned techniques for planting, tending, and harvesting cannabis. Early cannabis cultivation was relatively simple. Seeds would be planted in prepared soil in spring. The plants would grow through the summer with minimal tending, and harvesting would occur in fall when the plants matured. For fiber production, plants would be harvested before they flowered, while for seed production, plants would be allowed to mature fully. The techniques would have been similar to those used for other crops and would have been passed down through generations of farmers. The selection of cannabis varieties for specific purposes has occurred over thousands of years of cultivation. Hemp varieties bred for fiber would be selected for tall growth, strong stalks, and minimal branching, with little concern for flower or resin production. Varieties bred for psychoactive or medicinal use would be selected for large flower production and high resin content. Over many generations of selecting and replanting seeds from plants with desired traits, distinct varieties of cannabis emerged. In traditional cultivation systems in places like India, farmers developed extensive knowledge about cannabis growing. They would select specific seeds, would know when and where to plant for best results, would understand how to water and tend plants, and would have techniques for harvesting, drying, and processing cannabis for different preparations. This knowledge was cultural heritage passed from parent to child and shared within communities. The indoor cultivation of cannabis began to develop in the 20th century, particularly in countries where cannabis was illegal, and outdoor cultivation was risky due to law enforcement. Indoor cultivation allows year-round growing, provides control over environmental conditions, and conceals the operation from observation. Early indoor growing was simple, perhaps involving plants grown in closets or basements with basic lighting, but over time techniques became more sophisticated. The development of high-intensity discharge lamps, including metal halide and high-pressure sodium lights, made it possible to provide sufficient light for indoor cannabis to thrive. growers learned to control temperature, humidity, air circulation, and carbon dioxide levels to optimize growth. They developed hydroponic and aeroponic systems that grow plants in nutrient solutions rather than in soil, potentially increasing growth rates and yields. Indoor cultivation became a specialized practice with its own techniques, equipment, and culture. The illegal status of cannabis in many places paradoxically drove innovation in joint cultivation techniques as growers sought to maximize yield and potency while minimizing risk. Breeding programs, often conducted by underground enthusiasts, created numerous new strains with higher THC content and specific effect profiles. The average THC content of cannabis increased significantly from the 1970s to the present, with some modern strains containing 25% or more THC compared to perhaps 5–10% in typical cannabis from earlier decades. This increase in potency has raised public health concerns, as higher potency cannabis may increase the risk of adverse effects, including anxiety, paranoia, and potentially psychological dependence. However, proponents note that users can simply consume less of more potent cannabis to achieve desired effects, and that high-potency cannabis is more efficient to produce and transport, reducing costs and environmental impact. The practice of growing seedless cannabis by removing male plants became standard in cultivation for drug purposes. Seedless female plants, called sinsemilla from Spanish sin semilla, meaning without seed, produce larger and more resinous flowers than pollinated plants because they continue attempting to attract pollen throughout their flowering period. Sinsemilla cultivation requires identifying and removing male plants before they release pollen, which takes knowledge and attention but produces superior product. The techniques of cannabis cultivation continue to evolve. Modern commercial grows in legal markets use sophisticated climate control systems, automated watering and feeding systems, and carefully managed lighting schedules to maximize production. Some use greenhouse cultivation, which combines natural sunlight with supplemental lighting and climate control, potentially offering efficiency advantages over fully indoor growing. Large-scale outdoor cultivation continues in some regions where climate is favorable and regulations permit it. Organic and sustainable cultivation practices have become important to some growers and consumers. These practices minimize synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, use renewable energy, conserve water, and consider the environmental impact of cultivation. The cannabis industry in legal markets has sometimes been criticized for its large energy consumption, particularly for indoor cultivation, and for using pesticides that could leave residues in cannabis consumed by patients or other users. Sustainable growing practices attempt to address these concerns. The history of cannabis cultivation shows human ingenuity in working with this plant over thousands of years. From simple farming of hemp for fiber to sophisticated indoor systems producing high-potency drug varieties, cultivation methods have adapted to changing needs, technologies, and legal contexts. Understanding cultivation history helps us appreciate how the cannabis available today differs from what our ancestors would have used and how ongoing cultivation innovation continues to shape the cannabis landscape. Chapter 13: Cultural Tenuering Social Dimensions of Cannabis Use. Having examined the historical, scientific, and agricultural aspects of cannabis, let us finally explore the cultural and social dimensions of cannabis use. Cannabis has never been simply a plant or a drug, but has been invested with meanings, has been associated with specific social groups and practices, and has been a source of both community and conflict. In societies where cannabis use has traditional roots, including India, Jamaica, and parts of Africa and the Middle East, cannabis has cultural meanings that go beyond its pharmacological effects. In India, the association of cannabis with the god Shiva and its use in Hindu religious festivals gives cannabis sacred significance. Cannabis is not simply a recreational substance, but is a sacramental plant used in worship and spiritual practice. This religious dimension shapes how cannabis is understood and used and creates contexts where cannabis consumption is ritualized and meaningful rather than casual. In Jamaica, cannabis, locally called ganja, became associated with Rastafarianism, a religious and social movement that emerged in the 1930s. Rastafarians consider cannabis to be a sacred herb, with biblical roots and use it in religious ceremonies and meditation. The sacramental use of cannabis is central to Rastafarian identity and practice, and Rastafarians have been at the forefront of advocating for cannabis legalization, both in Jamaica and internationally. The close association between Rastafarianism and cannabis has influenced global cannabis culture, with Rastafarians, symbols and imagery becoming part of broader cannabis iconography. In the United States and Europe, cannabis use in the 20th century became associated with countercultural movements and with challenges to mainstream values. As discussed earlier, cannabis use exploded in the 1960s among young people who were rejecting conventional society and experimenting with alternative lifestyles. Cannabis became a symbol of rebellion, of openness to new experiences, and of rejection of the authority of the older generation. Using cannabis was a way of identifying with the counterculture and of demonstrating that one was part of the youth movement. The association between cannabis and music has been particularly strong. Jazz musicians in the early 20th century used cannabis and sang about it in their songs. In the 1960s and 1970s, rock musicians openly endorsed cannabis use and incorporated drug references into their lyrics and joint album art. Reggae music from Jamaica frequently referenced ganja and the Rastafarian spiritual use of cannabis. Hip-hop culture has included cannabis use and joint references as a common element. The connection between cannabis and music has been so strong that many people associate cannabis with musical creativity and joint with the experience of listening to music. Cannabis culture developed its own language, symbols, and rituals. Slang terms for cannabis proliferated, including marijuana, pot, weed, grass, herb, bud, ganja, and joint, many others. The number 420 became associated with cannabis, supposedly originating from a group of California high school students in the 1970s who would meet at 4:20 p.m. to smoke, and April 20th or 420 became joint, an informal cannabis holiday celebrated by users. The cannabis leaf became a universal symbol recognized around the world. The rituals of cannabis use, including rolling joints, passing them in circles, and the etiquette of sharing, became part of a shared culture among users. Certain behaviors and customs developed, including puff-puff-pass rotation, cornering the bowl to preserve green plant material for others, and various other informal rules that vary by social group but that create a sense of community and shared understanding among cannabis users. Cannabis use has also been associated with specific values and attitudes. Cannabis culture has often emphasized peace, tolerance, creativity, and openness to experience. Cannabis users have sometimes seen themselves as more enlightened or more aware than non-users, though of course this self-perception is not necessarily accurate. The association between cannabis and progressive politics, particularly advocacy for civil liberties and criminal justice reform, has made cannabis use a political as well as a personal choice for some users. However, cannabis culture has not been entirely positive or inclusive. The male-dominated nature of much cannabis culture, the commercialization and commodification of cannabis symbols and products, and the tensions between medical and recreational users, between longtime activists and new legal industry participants, and between different visions of what legalization should look like, have created divisions and conflicts. The romanticization of cannabis as harmless or as a panacea has sometimes obscured genuine health risks and social costs associated with use. The stigma associated with cannabis use has been a major social force for most of the 20th century. Cannabis users faced the risk of arrest and criminal records, which could affect employment, education, and many other aspects of life. Beyond legal consequences, users faced social stigma and judgment from family members, employers, and society. Generally, the label of being a pothead or a stoner carried negative connotations of being lazy, unmotivated, and irresponsible stereotypes that cannabis users had to navigate and resist. The process of destigmatization has occurred gradually as cannabis use became more common and more people knew cannabis users who contradicted the negative stereotypes. The medical cannabis movement helped reframe cannabis as medicine rather than as merely a recreational drug, making it more acceptable. The successes of legalization, showing that legal cannabis systems could function without causing social disaster, further reduced stigma. By the early 21st century, in many places cannabis use had become relatively normalized, at least among younger people, though stigma persists in some contexts and demographics. The commercialization of cannabis in legal markets has created new cultural dynamics cannabis businesses market their products with branding, packaging, and advertising similar to other consumer goods. Cannabis brands cultivate specific images and appeal to different market segments. The professionalization of the cannabis industry has brought in business people, marketers, and entrepreneurs who may have little connection to traditional cannabis culture. This commercialization has been welcomed by some as bringing legitimacy and quality control, but has been criticized by others as selling out the values of the cannabis movement and putting profits over principles. Social equity in cannabis legalization has become an important cultural and political issue. The recognition that cannabis prohibition fell disproportionately on minority communities and peers and that legalization should include efforts to repair this harm has created movements for restorative justice. Advocates call for expunging past cannabis convictions, for reserving licenses and economic opportunities in legal cannabis for people from communities harmed by prohibition, and for directing cannabis tax revenue toward communities that were over-policed. The implementation of social equity provisions has been challenging, but the principle that legalization should include justice for past harms has gained wide acceptance. As you drift off to sleep, having absorbed this comprehensive examination of cannabis history, science, cultivation, and culture, you can rest knowing that you now understand the full context of when people started smoking weed and how this ancient practice has evolved over thousands of years. Good night and sleep well.